Careful with that tray. We can't afford another breakage this month. Apparently, some people think crystal grows on trees.
Is this the new girl? She's very quiet.
Quiet is good. The last one talked far too much, right up until the police arrived.
What none of them knew that night, what none of them could have imagined, was that the quiet woman they had just humiliated in front of 20 guests held, in her own name, more power than this entire family had built in 20 years, and in 4 months, she would be the one deciding whether their name survived at all. But let's take it back way back to when it all started. Sipho Radebe had built Radebe Holdings from a single quarry outside Rustenburg into one of the country's largest mineral and logistics groups, and when he died on a quiet Tuesday in autumn, the obituaries called him a titan of industry. His daughter Lindiwe called him something simpler, the only person who had ever told her the truth about herself. The reading of the will took place in a glass-walled office on the 40th floor of the Radebe Holdings Tower, overlooking a city she had grown up above but rarely inside. Advocate Mokoena, her father's oldest friend and now executor of his estate, slid a single sheet across the table. "Your father added this clause 8 months ago," he said. "Before you take your seat as chairperson of this company, you will spend 4 months working as domestic help in an ordinary household, chosen at random from a registry, not by you, not by me. No one in that house may know who you are. If you break the condition, the shares default to the board. If you complete it with your name intact and your character unblemished, the company is yours outright." Lindiwe read the clause twice. "He wants to know if I'd still be someone worth trusting if I had nothing. He wanted to know if the money made you," Mokoena said gently, "or if you made the money mean something." She signed without asking for a copy to keep, because she understood her father well enough to know the clause was not a punishment. It was a question he had never been able to ask her directly while he was alive. Perhaps because he feared the answer, or perhaps because he wanted her to arrive at it herself, in her own time, without the shape of his expectation pressing down on it. 3 days later, a placement letter arrived from a domestic staffing agency in Santon, addressed to a woman named Lindiwe. No surname listed, no history attached, no wealth visible. The household was the Ndlovu residence, a sprawling double-story home behind high white walls on a quiet street lined with jacarandas, the kind of street where gardeners arrived before sunrise and left after guests had gone home for the night. She packed 1 suitcase, 2 uniforms, a handful of paperbacks, a photograph of her father standing in front of the first quarry he ever owned, and left her cars, her cards, and her name behind. She took a minibus taxi from a rented room in Bramley to begin the strangest 4 months of her life, watching the jacaranda-lined streets of Santon pass by a window that, for the first time since childhood, she was looking through rather than out of. The Ndlovu family had reasons to be careful. 6 months earlier, their previous domestic worker, a woman named Portia, who had served them for years, had been caught siphoning money from the household accounts and quietly pawning jewelry from Zanele Ndlovu's dressing room. The case ended with handcuffs at the gate and a humiliating headline in a local tabloid: "Santon family betrayed by trusted help." Bongani Ndlovu, owner of a mid-sized but ambitious construction firm chasing government infrastructure tenders, had made a private vow. After that, the next person to work in his house would be watched, tested, and never fully trusted. His wife, Zanele, who ran the household and half the social calendar of their neighborhood, agreed without hesitation. Their daughter Ayanda, 22, and recently returned from a fashion marketing course in Cape Town, treated the vow as an open invitation to be cruel. Only their son, Kagiso, 25 and finishing his final year of a civil engineering degree while working part-time at his father's firm, disagreed. "Punishing the next person for what the last one did isn't justice," he told his father over breakfast the week the new maid was due to arrive. "It's just fear wearing a badge." Bongani only grunted and turned back to his newspaper. He did not know that fear would cost him more than he had ever imagined, and that the woman walking through his gate that afternoon held, in her own name, more capital than his company had built in 20 years. The house itself told its own story to anyone who cared to read it. imported tile in the entrance hall, a wall of framed award certificates from the National Home Builders Registration Council, a garden Zanele redesigned every 2 years to match whatever she had seen most recently on her travels. It was a house built to be admired, and everyone who worked inside it understood, without being told twice, that admiration was the only currency the Ndlovas valued from the people who kept it running. Lindiwe stood at the gate holding her single suitcase, when Zanele Ndlovu opened the front door, arms already folded before she'd finished crossing the threshold. Her eyes moved over Lindiwe once, top to bottom, in the unhurried way of someone accustomed to appraising things that belonged to her. "So you're the one the agency sent," she said. "What's your name?" "Lindiwe, ma'am." "No surname? Just Lindiwe is fine." Bongani stepped forward from behind his wife, arms crossed over his chest, and delivered the speech Lindiwe would come to understand he had rehearsed before she'd even arrived. The last person who worked in this house had stolen from them, he said, and he didn't care where she'd come from or what hardship she carried with her. She would not touch what wasn't hers. She would not speak unless spoken to in front of guests. She would not ask for anything before it was owed to her. Was that understood? It was, she told him, her voice calm and steady, giving away nothing. From the staircase inside, Ayanda didn't look up from her phone as she added her own instruction. That Lindiwe used the back entrance from now on, so the smell of the taxi rank wouldn't follow her through the house. Zanele, unmoved by either exchange, told Lindiwe flatly where her room was, that her uniform was waiting on the bed, and that she should start with the windows, which were filthy. Lindiwe picked up her suitcase and said nothing more. She walked toward the back of the house without protest, without hesitation, the family's judgment of her already settled before she'd carried a single tray or ironed a single shirt. At the top of the stairs, unnoticed by his parents, Kagiso appeared just long enough to watch the whole exchange, his expression troubled, uncertain, the first flicker of something he wouldn't be able to name for weeks. He said nothing, not yet. The work itself did not frighten her. Lindiwe had grown up watching her father rise before dawn to walk his own quarry floors, and she had inherited his belief that no task was beneath a person who respected themselves. What she had not expected was the particular loneliness of being present in a house and invisible in it, of serving food she was not permitted to comment on, of standing silently in a corner during dinner parties while guests discussed politics and property prices as though the woman refilling their glasses had no opinions of her own. Zanele found small ways to remind her of her place daily, a folded pile of ironing redone for no reason, a comment about how some people just don't know how things are done in a proper house. Ayanda was worse in her carelessness, leaving expensive scarves on the floor for Lindiwe to retrieve, speaking about her in the third person while she stood 2 meters away refilling a teapot. Bongani rarely spoke to her at all, which she came to understand was its own kind of erasure. Only one person in that house behaved as though she were fully human. Kagiso began arriving in the kitchen early, before his parents woke, ostensibly for coffee before class, and found himself lingering to talk, about books stacked on the counter that she read on her breaks, about the news, about nothing important at all. He did not know her name meant anything beyond the one word she gave. He only knew that she answered him with a precision and a dry humor that nobody else in his family's employ ever had. There were small kindnesses, too, in those early weeks that she had not expected to matter as much as they did. The gardener, an older man named Vusi, who had worked the property for a decade, began leaving a spare avocado from his own lunch on the kitchen windowsill for her without comment. He also, she quickly learned, considered himself a gifted singer and treated the hedge trimmer as a backing track for a one-man concert only she was forced to appreciate at close range. Vusi, she told him once, straight-faced, watering can in hand. "The roses are wilting. I think it's a review." He laughed so hard he nearly took the ear off a topiary bush, and after that singing quietly became their private joke. He'd hum something dramatically off-key whenever Zanele's back was turned, just to watch Lindiwe fight a smile while carrying a tray of tea. The other part-time staff, a cleaner who came twice a week, taught her the fastest route to the taxi rank on her one afternoon off, and never once asked what she'd done before this to end up scrubbing someone else's floors. Dignity, she was learning, did not always arrive from the people who owned the house. Sometimes it arrived from the people who understood without needing to be told exactly what it cost to hold your head up in a place that had decided not to see you. And sometimes it arrived disguised as a man loudly murdering a love ballad over the sound of a lawnmower.
To 40 wonderful years of my beautiful wife, Zanele, may you stay exactly as young as you tell people you are.
Careful with that tray. We can't afford another breakage this month. Apparently some people think crystal grows on trees.
Is this the new girl? She's very quiet.
Quiet is good. The last one talked far too much, right up until the police arrived.
That night, after the guests left and the garden lights were switched off one string at a time, Kagiso found Lindiwe in the kitchen washing the last of the glasses by hand, though the dishwasher stood empty beside her. He asked her why. "Because your mother's crystal has been in her family 3 generations," she said without looking up, "and I would rather scrub for an hour than be blamed for a chip I didn't make." It was, he realized, the most self-aware sentence anyone in his family's house had spoken all evening, including the people who owned the crystal. He began to notice other things after that, the way she read business columns on her one free evening a week, the way she corrected a contractor's arithmetic error on an invoice left on the counter without ever mentioning she'd done it, the way she carried herself like someone who had simply chosen, for reasons of her own, to be underestimated. He did not fall for her because she was mysterious. He fell for her because she was the only unguarded conversation left in a house full of people performing for each other. And though he could not have named it yet, some part of him understood that whatever she was hiding, it was not smallness. He began, without quite admitting it to himself, to arrange his mornings around hers, leaving for campus 10 minutes later than he needed to, choosing the chair at the kitchen table that faced the sink rather than the window. His mother noticed the pattern before he did and said nothing, assuming it was simple boredom. His father never noticed at all, too occupied with tender documents and a contract he had already begun spending in his head. The kitchen held its usual late evening quiet. The light above the sink, the only one still burning in the house. Kagiso sat at the wooden table with a structural dynamics textbook open in front of him, unread for the 4th time that night, while Lindiwe dried the last plate at the counter behind him. He gestured at the book with a self-deprecating grin, admitting he'd read the same page 4 times and still had no idea what it said. Lindiwe glanced over and told him dryly that he might try reading it the right way up. He turned the book around with mock solemnity, declaring that this changed everything, and she nearly laughed, a real one, quickly swallowed before it could fully surface. Then his tone shifted, gentler, more careful. He asked if he could ask her something without it being rude, and she told him he could. He wanted to know where she'd learned to read a balance sheet the way she had. He'd seen her studying his father's tender documents on the counter the week before, and most people, he said, wouldn't even know what they were looking at. She answered that she read a lot, that it passed the time, folding the dish towel with unusual care as she said it. He told her, plainly, that wasn't an answer. She met his eyes and agreed, no, it wasn't. He leaned forward then, telling her he wasn't trying to trap her, only that in 4 months she'd said less about herself than anyone he'd ever met, and somehow he understood her better than people he'd known his entire life. She said quietly that it might be the nicest thing anyone in that house had said to her. He answered with another, that whatever his parents believed about her, he didn't think they were right, that she was the most composed person under pressure he had ever watched work. Something passed between them in the silence that followed, unspoken, the first real crack in the wall she'd kept carefully in place for months. She told him quietly to be careful, that not everything held quietly was small. Then she left the kitchen, and he sat alone with that sentence for a long time after she'd gone. 3 months into her placement, an envelope of cash meant for the gardener's wages went missing from the study drawer. Zanele found it empty on a Sunday morning and, within the hour, had convinced herself and her husband of exactly who was responsible. "It's happening again," she told Bongani, her voice tight with old fear. "I told you we couldn't trust another one so soon." There was no evidence beyond the coincidence of a missing envelope and a woman with no surname, but suspicion in that house required no evidence, only precedent. Bongani cut Lindiwe's pay for the month pending investigation without explanation, and Ayanda made sure the rest of the household staff heard the accusation before Lindiwe herself was told directly. By the time Zanele finally confronted her, the story had already hardened into fact in 3 other people's minds. Lindiwe could have ended it in a single sentence. She could have named her father, her company, the number of zeros in the account the missing 2,000 rand would never have tempted her toward. She thought about it for the length of one breath, standing in the hallway outside the study, and then she thought of the will's condition of the 4 months she had already survived, and of the version of herself her father had wanted to meet at the end of this. Not the woman who could silence a room with her surname, but the one who could hold her composure without it. So she said nothing, and walked into the study to be accused of a theft she had never committed. Zanele stood behind the desk when she entered, arms crossed, and told her plainly that the gardener's wages were missing. 2,000 rand, gone from that very drawer, and she was the only one who cleaned in there. Lindiwe answered steadily that she hadn't taken it. Bongani, without turning from the window, muttered that the last one had said the same thing. Lindiwe held her composure and told him carefully that she understood his history with trust in that house, but she wasn't responsible for a debt someone else had left behind, and she wouldn't carry the weight of an accusation with no proof behind it. Zanele snapped at her to watch her tone, and Lindiwe replied evenly that she wasn't raising her voice, only asking to be judged for what she had done, not for what she reminded them of. Bongani finally turned from the window and told her, coldly, that her pay would be withheld for the month regardless, as a lesson in how seriously the household took matters like this. Lindiwe held his gaze a moment longer than was comfortable, then nodded once and left without another word. Outside the door, unseen by his parents, Kagiso had heard everything, and for the first time his expression toward his father was not respect but disappointment. 2 weeks later, Ndlovu Construction stood at the edge of the largest opportunity in its history, a multi-year infrastructure subcontract with Radebe Holdings, whose logistics division was expanding road access to 3 new quarry sites. Bongani had chased the tender for over a year and had finally secured a final stage meeting with the company's board, a meeting he believed could double his firm's revenue within 18 months. He spent that week rehearsing his pitch obsessively, pressing his best suit, reminding Zanele twice that this contract was the one that changes everything for this family. Kagiso, invited to attend as the firm's incoming junior manager, said little. He was still turning over the confrontation he'd overheard in the study, and a quieter, more unsettling thought had begun to form, that his family had spent 4 months deciding who deserved dignity based on nothing but a lack of curiosity about who stood in front of them. Neither he nor his father knew that the acting chairperson set to review the final contract had, 3 days earlier, quietly completed the final condition of her father's will. Bongani entered the boardroom that morning with total confidence, extending his hand toward the head of the table and beginning his introduction, until he stopped mid-sentence.
Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to... Lindiwe?
Please, everyone, take your seats so we can begin.
The chair at the head of the table turned. It was Lindiwe in a tailored suit, her posture entirely different from the woman who had scrubbed his crystal by hand weeks earlier, yet unmistakably the same person. He said her name aloud, visibly shaken. She greeted him calmly, professionally, telling him he already knew her name, and asked him to sit. Kagiso, stunned, said her surname aloud himself, Radebe, Sipho Radebe's daughter, and Lindiwe confirmed it, adding that for the last 4 months she had also been the woman who ironed his family's linen and had been accused of stealing wages she never touched. Bongani lowered slowly into his chair, folder still in hand, unable to speak. Advocate Mokoena, standing near the head of the table, let the silence sit. Lindiwe told them, not cruelly but plainly, that she wasn't there to embarrass him. that she was there to review the contract on its merits, the same as she would for any firm, but that she would be lying if she said the last 4 months had taught her nothing about how his household treated people who couldn't immediately benefit them. Bongani said quietly that he hadn't known. She reminded him that no one was supposed to know. That had been the point. Kagiso set down his folder and told her, looking directly at her, that he had meant everything he'd said in that kitchen, and that knowing who she was didn't change a single word of it. Something in her expression softened briefly before she turned back to the room and told them the board would review the tender fairly over the next 2 weeks, regardless of anything that had happened in her kitchen, and suggested Bongani spend those 2 weeks considering whether fairness was something his household only afforded to people whose wealth he could see. It was then that Bongani, finding a quieter voice than anyone in the room had ever heard from him, admitted that they'd found the 2,000 rand 2 days after the accusation, fallen behind the desk, and that he'd withheld her pay for nothing and never told her. Lindiwe paused for a long moment before answering simply that no, he hadn't. Advocate Mokoena spoke then for the first time, noting evenly that Ms. Radebe had fulfilled every condition of her father's will 3 days earlier, 4 months, unblemished, under a name that had offered her no protection at all, and that he didn't believe he'd ever seen a clearer answer to a question a father had been too afraid to ask his daughter directly. Bongani looked down at his folder, then back up at her, genuine shame crossing his face for the first time in the story, and told her he owed her more than an apology could cover. She answered, not unkindly, that he shouldn't spend the next 2 weeks writing her a better one. He should spend them deciding what kind of employer he wanted to be to the next person who walked through his gate with one suitcase and no surname he recognized. Then she rose, nodded once to the room, and left. Bongani sat in stunned silence, his folder still unopened in front of him, while Kagiso watched the door long after she'd gone. The story moved through Santon faster than any tender ever had. By the following week, 3 other households on the same street had heard some version of it, that the Nolovis's humiliated maid was in fact the heiress to Radebe Holdings, and that she had sat across from Bongani in a boardroom he had spent a year trying to enter. Zanele did not leave her bedroom for 2 days. Ayanda, for the first time in her adult life, found herself the subject of ridicule among her own friend group rather than the source of it, as clips of her party comments circulated in group chats she wasn't part of. Bongani, for his part, did the one thing his pride had never permitted before. He asked his son to help him write a letter, not to the company but to Lindiwe directly. Kagiso refused to write it for him. If his father meant it, he told him, he should write it himself, in his own words, the way she'd had to earn every word of respect she'd gotten from them. It was, Bongani would later admit, the first time his son had ever spoken to him like an equal rather than an employee of the family name. Bongani sat with a blank page for 3 nights before he managed a single paragraph he didn't tear up, about the quarry his own father had worked in the Free State, about the years before Ndlovu construction existed, about how easily a man could forget the ground he came from once he'd built something tall enough to stand on. He didn't ask for the contract in the letter. He asked instead whether 4 months could ever be enough to be forgiven for 4 months of not looking closely enough at the person standing in front of him. That evening, in her apartment with the city lights glowing through the window, Lindiwe answered a call from Kagiso, telling him gently that she'd wondered if he would call. He admitted he hadn't been sure he should, unsure if she'd want to hear from anyone connected to that house again. She told him he had never been the house. He had been the only room in it that felt honest. He said his father had written her a letter, a real one, in his own words, no lawyer, no assistant, and that he hadn't read it himself at his father's request. She said she would read it before deciding anything about the contract. He agreed that was fair, then asked if he could ask her something else, separate from all of it. Whether any of it had been real, the mornings in the kitchen, what he'd felt talking to her. She told him softly that all of it had been real. The only thing that hadn't been real was her last name, and even that she'd never actually lied about, only never told him the rest of it. He said he'd like to start there with the rest of it if she'd let him. She answered with a small smile in her voice, telling him to come by her office on Thursday. Not the boardroom, her actual office, where they'd start with coffee, the way they always did. She ended the call and looked out at the city lights a moment longer than necessary, the first unguarded smile of the whole story crossing her face. The contract between Lindiwe Construction and Radebe Holdings was approved 3 weeks later, on its merits, exactly as Lindiwe had promised. A decision reviewed by the full board, not by her alone, accompanied by a private note from her to Bongani. Fairness was never the test he'd thought it was. Character was. Bongani never fully recovered his old certainty, and in the months that followed, those who worked for him noticed a small but permanent change. He greeted every new employee by name on their first morning and never again withheld a wage without proof. Zanelli took longer to change but began, quietly, to volunteer at a domestic workers' advocacy center in the city, a fact she didn't publicize and Lindiwe never mentioned to anyone. As for Lindiwe, she kept one habit from her 4 months at the Lindiwe house. She still made her own tea in the mornings in a small kitchen before the rest of the world woke to ask anything of her, because her father had been right about one thing above all else. It was never the money that had made her who she was. It was what she chose to do when no one thought she had any power at all. Ayanda, of all people, was the one who eventually wrote her own letter, not through her parents, not dictated by anyone, just a short and clumsy note slipped through Radebe Holdings' front reception, admitting she had never once, in 4 months, asked the woman refilling her glass a single question about her own life. Lindiwe kept that letter longer than she kept her father's original will, because it had cost a 22-year-old more honesty than most adults in that house had managed in a lifetime. Vusi got a raise he never asked for, and according to Kagiso, took it as confirmation that his singing had finally been recognized by the universe. He was, by all accounts, worse than ever after that, and considerably prouder of it. Kagiso arrived at her office that Thursday, and every Thursday after, not as the son of a contractor seeking favor, and not as a man courting an heiress, but as the same person who had once poured her coffee before 6 in the morning and asked her questions nobody else in that house had thought to ask. Some things, she was learning, really did survive the reveal of a surname intact. The tea, the Thursdays, the quiet, unshowy kind of seeing another person that had started in a kitchen behind a house on a street lined with jacarandas, long before either of them knew what the other one was worth. If a story about dignity, disguise, and being seen for who you really are moved you today, subscribe for the next one. Because sometimes the person you overlook is the one holding everything together.